think that's probably good. So again, aloha and welcome everybody. We're so pleased for you all to join us this evening. My name is Alfie Garcia. I'm the Information Resources and Collection Management Librarian at the University of Hawaii at West Oahu. We're honored to have Professor Kealani Cook from the UH West Oahu Humanities Division, where he teaches history. I present today a session titled Misinformation and the Raid on Parihaka, New Zealand, 1881. Kealani's bio is available on the event website. This evening's presentation by Kealani is part of a series of programs presented as part of Misinformation Week, which is day 2 of such. The week-long slate of events explores important themes that are related to misinformation. So the recording will be available to all attendees. You're all automatically muted, but there will be a chance to ask questions at the end of the session. You can also drop them into the chat. I'll be kind of monitoring and making sure I collect them all. But without further ado, it's over to you, Kealani. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Alfie and Karina for setting us up and for inviting me, and mahalo for everyone for showing up at 6 o'clock. So just a little bit of background. What I'm actually extended this out since between when you invited me and started and now. A lot of the stuff that I was going to look at with Parihaka in New Zealand, really similar things happening with the Mau movement in Samoa in the late 1920s, early 1930s. So I kind of pulled them together into one presentation. And this is coming out of some pretty early research that I'm doing right now on civil disobedience in Oceania. We tend to think really recent things like Mauna Kea, a bunch of things that happen in Aotearoa, like marches, etc., that are the last 50, 60 years. But there is a much longer history of civil disobedience in Oceania, and that's some of the stuff that I want to dig into and look at how, specifically with regards to misinformation, how governments, colonial governments, New Zealand, both times it's New Zealand, how the New Zealand government in both of these cases manipulated information and sometimes created misinformation, sometimes just promoted misinformation in an effort to justify their suppression of first the Māori people and then later on the Samoans. So let me jump into this. Okay, slideshow. Okay, does it look reasonable? Okay. Push that over to the side, put the chat down here. Okay, so some of the basics. Parihaka is over in this green area in Aotearoa on the North Island. There is this region called the Taranaki region, and it's in the center of it. There's Mount Taranaki. It's a massive extinct volcano, and very similar to something like Mauna Kea. There's a very close connection between the people of the region and the mountain, and one of this area it's all some pretty awful fighting from the 1820s and 30s all the way through to the 1860s. Some of the early stuff was attacks from some of the people of the Waikato region, which is up and to the right of the Taranaki region. And that led to a lot of people fleeing, heading further south, some going as far as Wellington, which is down at the sort of between the two islands, the tip of the North Island on the very south, that would be Wellington. And then coming back, reestablishing themselves as things sort of became more peaceful with the Waikato. But then in the 1860s, as the government was trying to purchase more and more, purchase land from the Maori people, often purchasing land from like one or two Maori people in a particular EV or sort of extended family group or tribe. They would purchase from one or two people and then be like, haha, this is ours now. And so obviously there's going to cause a lot of tensions with everybody else who didn't sell their land and now is finding the government coming and taking their land. So this leads to some tensions, and there's some fighting within EV. There's some fighting within Hapu, which is like the smaller groups, or the people who are selling, the people who refuse to sell. And then that extends out as the government is saying, hey, we bought some of this, like we bought this land, this is ours now, and we're going to sell it to settlers. Other people try to stop the surveys and the roads as the government is going through to try and claim that land. And early on, for instance, one of the things to signal that this was a non-violent thing was to send the women and children out to sit in the road. You can't move. You can't go through. We're not starting a fight. We're not starting a war. You can't accuse us of trying to start a war because we're sending the women and children. And the women and children are the ones that are stopping these things from going through. Once that happened, the government's like, okay, fine, we're sending soldiers now. It will be a war. And what's called the first Taranaki War is launched by the government. One of the chief that had been very friendly with the New Zealand government up until that point sets up a PA, basically a fortification. A PA can be a fortification, but also sort of a fallback position. Sets one up in front of where the government's going to go, knowing that the government will attack him. And then once the government attacks him, he then kind of calls out for aid, flees immediately. This thing was just set up to be basically to trick the government into attacking him. Once the government attacks, he pulls back and says, see, I did not start this war. They fired first, and calling in allies. And that starts the first Taranaki War. That ends. The government then goes and invades in other places, comes back. And there's a second Taranaki War when they go and start doing what the settler governments do. They go and they start stealing more land. Now, in that period, what the government did was they declared this whole district confiscated. And they said, we're confiscating the whole territory, but we're only confiscating it because we absolutely need to for security, because we, one, want to take land away from the people who are fighting against us because we're taking away their land. And two, we want to put settlers on the ground who will be military settlers. We will put people on the ground who will fight for the government and like fight away all the mean, awful, horrible Maori that we're stealing land from. And they promised that any Maori that did not fight against the government could retain their land even within those districts. Now, that sort of putting military settlers on the ground, I mean, that's old school settler colonialism stuff. I mean, we're talking about China doing that in like the Han Dynasty. I mean, that is standard stuff that the Romans did it, etc. That is the definition of settler colonialism. I'm going to put settlers on the ground in order to fight you so we can go and steal more land. But the war stopped and they didn't put the settlers on the land because they didn't have enough settlers to go and take all this land. But they continued to claim that they confiscated all this territory. And as the years go by, they tried to move in and take more and more and more of it. Now, the original premise was always that we took this land only from the people who were fighting and only to put these military settlers on. But they need money. And they start trying to go in and survey this land and chop it up and sell it off from beneath the Maori who are there in order to fund the government or to pay off the government debt, which was pretty substantial because they kept spending money stealing land from Maori people. And that's expensive because you have to send in the troops. So this is all happening. There's land wars are pretty consistent through a lot of of Aotearoa, just like it is in the US and Canada, etc. This is one of the things settler colonialism does. It justifies wars to take land by claiming they fought against us and never mentioning they fought against us because we're taking their land. What does this have to do with Parihaka? So Parihaka is a small community that's right, you can see it on that yellowish picture, right under Taranaki. And Parihaka was started by two Māori chiefs, Tohu and his nephew Tefiti. And Tefiti is often seen as, Tefiti gets a lot more press and attention, but it seems to be because Tefiti is in the sort of, he's a younger chief and he is probably subordinate, like because of that, he's the nephew, he's subordinate genealogically. He is the forward one and Tohu is the rear one. So they start this place and I'm blanking now if they're Wesleyans but they're Christian. They're not Church of England. They're one of the other sort of denominations running all over and missionizing everything. And they, at a certain point, they join in even with the Waikato chiefs under the King movement, and they start saying, hey, missionaries should leave. We're already Christians. You don't need to keep sending missionaries. You should leave, and we should be able to control our own lands. We're not going to create hostility with people who are already here, but you can't keep coming and taking our lands. And they sort of declare this place Parihaka, which is way back in the sort of far away from most definitely from any of the European settlements, but kind of in the bush. They go back towards the mountain, clear out an area, start planting there, and declare this a town of peace. And at Parihaka, the main thing was you cannot participate in any warfare for the government, against the government, conflicts within Iwi, conflicts between Iwi, none of that. At Parihaka, there is no warfare. That was the main thing. That was what Tefiti, actually, might be Tefiti, can be Tewiti. Apparently in the Taranaki district, they don't do for the WH, it's a wu. But then everywhere else, it's Tefu. But in this place, there's no fighting, there's no warfare. They had been chased out. Their family had been chased out by the Waikato. They had gone all the way down to Wellington. They had come back up. And then while they were there at the place where the missionaries were, Warea, they were bombarded by the British, even though they had nothing to do with the war. They were bombarded by the British. So they're like, this is it. Like every time there's fighting and warfare, there's just death everywhere. And we will create this village. And they start to grow more and more prominent in the area because other Māori are looking to this place as a basically the same thing. It's a break from the war. It's a place to not be involved in the war without surrendering completely to the government and just being like, oh, the British can do whatever they want. Because at Parihaka, they were intent on holding on to their land, but also not creating warfare. And this is going to, this is going to be really important during that war. There's a smaller war called, led by this guy, Tito Kawaru, who for a few years just terrified all the European settlers there. And it was the same sort of thing where he was just like, hey, stop taking our land, stop taking our land. Okay, fine, let's have a war. And that war actually ends in part because Tito Kawaru is able to go to Parihaka. First, he sends some of his people there to live there and show that they're willing to live in peace. And then he goes and he lives there. And he lives around the region until the British can accept that he is no longer fighting, that he is a peaceful person. So that, like, Parihaka was really essential for creating peace in the area. And the British talk back and forth about how, like, oh, it's great that all this peace is happening. At the same time, out the other side of their mouth, they're condemning Tahiti and Tohu for being prophets, because they're like, well, they know the Bible. They actually get really critical. They're like, these guys know the Bible so well that they believe in it. And that's insane, which is funny for the people who are sending missionaries out. Eventually, they start to be a little more honest. And in the mid 1870s, you actually see some of the government reports that say things like the biggest proponents of peace in the district are at Parihaka, but they're also the biggest obstacles we have in the region. because the people of Parihaka and Te Fiti and Tohu in particular are so intent on maintaining peace that they will resist things that they think will cause turmoil, like us going in and surveying and stealing all the land. And they start talking about like essentially being a little bit more open in their internal reports about like, let's face it, they'd rather have warfare that allows them to take land than peace that prevents them from taking land. And that is really becomes the center of the Parihaka sort of world, is this town that is bringing people in from all these different iwi, former opponents of the government that fought in wars, former people who fought for the government, all coming together in this non-violent sort of town as a core of resistance to taking land. Now, at a certain point, the government decides, screw it, we need to take the land anyway because we have bills to pay, and stealing land from Māori and selling it is how we are going to pay those bills. And they start surveying more and more of the land, and a bunch of people are following, like Māori are following along behind the surveys and just like yanking all the pins. And then they get upset with that. And then the surveyors start heading right for, remember, Tito Kawaru is the guy that for years they were like, he is the biggest threat. He's the boogeyman. He's scaring all of us. He's out there fighting. Tito Kawaru for like 10 years at this point has been peacefully farming. He and his people are farmers. That's what most inland Māori people are. They're farmers. He's sort of growing out his farm. He has all these cultivations, but it's on land that the government says, oh, we confiscate, that's our land. But as long as you're peaceful, we're not going to come and bother you. Except now we need land. And so they aim the government road right through his plantings. And they say, well, if we could go down there, and he actually comes out and it's like, you guys, I don't know if you're trying to start a war or something, but if you just go 2 miles down that way, and he takes one of the New Zealand administrators, that's a local administrator, is like, hey, come with me. They go down, they point out, and they both agree, like, this is where the road should go. The administrator goes back to the office, he goes back to his house, and then the surveyors keep going straight for his place. And it's just this thing like, you are clearly trying to start a war here. You're trying to start fighting because that allows you to go and just grab more land. And they're grabbing the land anyway, but that would actually speed up the process. And he goes to Parihaka, and he goes to Te Fiti, and he goes to Tohu, and he tells them, we need to do something about this. And so they go and they sent out a bunch of men to just go out and pack up the survey equipment. And they're like, hey, if you want to pack this yourself, I don't want to break into your stuff. And the surveyors talk about how they're all happy and smiling, incredibly polite, and they brought us food and everything. But they're like, either you pack up your shit and go, or we pack up your shit and go, but someone's packing up your shit and you're going. And so they pack them up, take them across the river, drop them off. We'll be back. They drop off a bunch of food later on, and they're just like, you guys stay on that side of the river. Don't come and survey anymore. And the government loses its damn mind. So they're like, well, this is an affront to us. And this is the start of the civil disobedience of Parihaka. And there had been cases of this kind of civil disobedience. For instance, the women and children being sent out to stand in front of the surveys. The government is portraying this as civil disobedience. This is, you are not obeying us. What's kind of interesting is the lawyers now, New Zealand lawyers now, who have gone through and looked at some of this stuff, working for the Waitangi Commission, they've gone through and looked at a lot of this stuff, and they're like, actually, a lot of this couldn't really be considered civil disobedience, because for it to be civil disobedience, you have to purposely break laws. And if you look at the laws in place, like, the government's actually breaking the laws by going and trying to claim the land years after the confiscation happened, if the confiscation was just to put military settlers and for national security. You can't keep using national security 10 years, 15 years after the national security crisis has ended. So it's civil disobedience in the eyes of the government, in the eyes of the people of Parihaka and the neighboring region. It's not. What they're doing is protecting the land that is theirs, that they are not disobeying the government. They are making sure that the rules are followed in a peaceful manner. And the government keeps sort of infringing. And then Te Fiti and Tohu send out a bunch of their guys to go and plow into lands that were the source, the lands that were the source of the second Taranaki region or war and the first Taranaki region. They sent out teams of plows to go and plow through the European settlers' land that the European settlers have taken from them, that were the two spots where the war started. And this is a reminder that what they're basically saying is like, hey, you're trying to start another war, and us plowing this land up that's what you're doing. You're coming and just taking the land because you think it's yours. Well, we still think that land is ours. So we're going to plow it, and we're going to plant, they plowed it, and they're like, we're going to plant wala, or not wala, kumara, which is like wala, it's the sweet potato. We're just going to plant. We're going to plant corn. We're going to plant wala. We're reclaiming this land with the plows. And the guys that they sent out for the very first group that got arrested included Tito Kawaru, included this fucking war chief, right? That goes out and is like, nah, I'm plowing from now on. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna plow. And the guy who they sent with him to get arrested was Mata Makaatea. No, sorry. Mata Akea. I keep screwing stuff up in my head by translating it into Hawaiian and then trying to get it back and losing it. And I apologize to any Te Reo speakers because I'm gonna Hawaiianize a bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be Hawaiianized. So this guy had been one of the government supporters. This is someone that the government always was like, he is on our side. He's one of our guys. Like in every war, they knew he would be on their side. And he is the guy standing next to Tito Kawaru at the plow, right? Not on the same plow, they're on different plows, but they're the first ones to get arrested. And they're both sort of older, well-respected chiefs, but it is a signal to the government that like, we are united in this area. We are all united that we are not going to stand for this anymore. And we are going to do it peacefully, but don't expect us, just because we're being peaceful, don't expect us to just let you take the land. The next thing the government started going through, they stopped surveying the land, but they started putting roads in. And again, they were just like, hey, the best place. The other thing is they're like, well, we just want some of the land. And what the government was marking out was like all the land they were taking was all the flat, already cleared land that's good for agriculture. And they knew it was good for agriculture because that's where the people of Parihaka and the neighboring towns, that's where they had all their crops. So they just wanted all the lands that can feed people. And they're like, you guys can go and just live on the side of the mountain where it's rough and steep. So the government starts putting roads through, and they're putting the roads, again, right through people's cultivations. And what all the livestock are roaming free, and you build the fence around your cultivation. So it's the fence doesn't keep the livestock in, it keeps the livestock out from wherever you're planting. And so the government surveyors are they're just knocking down all these fences and allowing their horses and all these other horses to come in, and all the cows come in and like eat up people's crops. And so the people of Parihaka start fencing, and the government was like, hey, this is just as bad as the plowing. Oh, sorry. They arrested all the plowmen, and they arrested all the plowmen, and then they realized they were committing misdemeanor vandalism or misdemeanor property crime, like misdemeanor level property crimes, which could be punished for 2 months. And they're like, we can't send them away for 2 months. They'll be back. So they passed laws saying that these people cannot go to trial, and will just keep putting off their trials. And every year they just put off their trials. They held them indefinitely in direct violation of British legal tradition, New Zealand legal tradition. They held them indefinitely without trial because there was such a threat to the government because they were plowing. Same thing with the fencers. They throw all the fencers in jail. Every time the government goes through and smashes through a fence and lets the cattle in, people would go and put the fence back up across the road. And so they start arresting people for putting in fences that are protecting their crops from the government's like horses. It's bad shit. And they're putting these people in jail for like, we don't know. You don't know how long you're going to be in there. Eventually, after about 2 years, year and a half, they start letting people out. But I mean, people got a year and a half in prison down on the South Island where it's freezing cold. Some of them died in prison because they were not taken care of very well there, for misdemeanor property damage. And that really starts to illustrate for a lot of other Māori and for others within New Zealand that were starting to like pay attention, like this is kind of messed up, how bad this was, like how like the New Zealand government is claiming to be the civilized ones, and this is what they're doing to people who are just trying to plant their crops. So that's some of the tactics that they use. The government will slowly build up to the point where they're like, hey, we need to just invade. And they wait until the governor is Governor Gordon. He's appointed by the British Crown, and he has to sign off on everything. And usually will just do whatever the New Zealand Parliament says to do. The New Zealand Parliament elects the prime minister, and the prime minister sets up the cabinet, and the cabinet sort of runs everything, and then the governor just signs off on stuff. And one of the things that the governor is there to do is make sure they don't do batshit crazy things. In 1881, they have some elections coming up. They want to steal more land, and Parihaka becomes the thing for all of the politicians on the west side of the North Island. That's the thing that they're going to use to get reelected. They want to get out there. They want to take that land. They want to make sure that more settlers are out there in their districts so that they can sell land to them. And then those people will vote for them because they're the ones that got rid of Parihaka. And so they wait until the governor leaves New Zealand. He goes to Fiji. And when he goes to Fiji, they push through an emergency legislation to go and raid Parihaka. And that's what they do. November 5th, 1881. Hundreds and hundreds of militia are called up, armed cops and militia, and sent down to raid Parihaka. The people at Parihaka know this is happening. Te Whiti and Tohu tell everybody, don't resist. When they arrest me, allow them to arrest us. When they come, give them food. When they come through, like the children will go out and do a haka for them. We will welcome them in, and when we're arrested, you guys keep doing what you need to do. And so yeah, it's a big event. It's peaceful on the side of the people of Parihaka, including a number of people who had been fighters and warriors in decades past. It's violent in terms of the government because they go in, and once they arrest Te Whiti and Tohu, they start tearing down homes, tearing down, burning all of people's goods, forcibly pushing people out of Parihaka, sending them to different parts. They're like, oh, you're not supposed to be at Parihaka because Parihaka is pulling people in from all over the North Island. They're forcing them to go to, like, you're supposed to be in this other area. You're a Waikato. You need to go. So they're basically kicking people out of Parihaka and sending them back to whatever areas they had been from originally as a way of breaking the strength of Parihaka. And oh, sorry, I forgot this. The worst thing in terms of civil disobedience, the worst thing that the people of Parihaka had been doing in the government size, where they were having these monthly meetings that everybody locally shows up for, but also these yearly or twice a year meetings, especially September seems to be a big one, where people are coming from all along the coast, all the way down to Wellington, all the way up. People from the King District, Waikato, they're all coming in, and they have these huge 2,000, 3,000 person meetings where they talk about peace and resistance. And that was one of the most offensive things to the government, is that Te Whiti and Tohu are setting up a sort of a space where Māori can come together and talk and discuss things and how they're going to resist the government. And that is not okay in the eyes of a settler government. So they go through, they invade, kick everybody out, and then arrest Te Whiti and Tohu, hold them for a couple of years, and then think they've broken it and split up all the land, sell it off, give back a small fraction to the Māori of the area, and then Te Whiti and Tohu, when they're released, come back and start the meetings up, and remain for a long time a center for Māori in the district to sort of like come together and sort of emphasize this peaceful resistance. It was in some ways a failure because it didn't stop the New Zealanders from taking all the land, but it was successful in that because it was there and it created this peaceful space for resistance, it prevented another war from breaking out, because every time those wars broke out, the Maori people were the ones who suffered the most. So there's a success and a failure there. And then I want to move on real quick to Samoa. So that was the 1870s, 1880s. This is the Mau movement in Samoa in the 1920s and 1930s. And part of it is New Zealand has taken over Samoa. First, the Germans took over Western Samoa, and then Germany, you know, had that whole World War I thing. New Zealand moves in, takes it over from Germany. And at first, the Samoan people seem kind of like, okay, we'll see how New Zealanders are, and maybe they won't be as bad as the Germans. And then the Spanish flu hits, the New Zealand administration botches it horribly. The administrator basically argues that like the Samoans are dying of the Spanish flu, which by the way is killing people across the globe on a much more sort of horrific basis than even COVID did. And he says, oh, it's the Samoans are dying because they're lazy, because they don't want to help themselves. And the government basically shut off any support for the Samoan people, including American doctors in American Samoa that the Navy was willing to send over to help. And the New Zealand administration said, no, the Samoans just got to deal with it. So like 20% of the population died. Right there, a lot of people at that point are like, that's the moment where the New Zealand administration is no longer a potential friend. We know who these people are. We just got to figure out how to get rid of them. Different New Zealand administrators from that point on into the later 1920s are going to, they will claim that they want like the Samoans to participate in government, but they will do it through a council that is appointed by the New Zealanders, who is paid by the New Zealanders, and there is no feedback from the population level back to that council. So they basically have, I don't want to say like a tame group, but they have like a group of people that they know will always agree with them. And they depend on that as their justification for we're ruling Samoa, but these chiefs, these Matai, are in support of us. So therefore we're ruling with the support of the Samoan people. But more and more Samoan people sort of start pushing back. This guy right here is Tupua Tamasese Lealofi III. Who is a holder, is a young man, but he's a holder of one of the highest, like 4 highest family-based titles in Samoa. And he gets in a conflict with his neighbor who's a missionary, and the missionary tells him that he has to cut his hedges because the hedges are blocking the missionary's view of the ocean. And he's like, you don't come here and tell me to cut my hedges. Like, that's what, like, what's wrong with you? Like, what are you, like, a colonial? And so the governor removes his title and exiles him, sends him to a different village across the island, says he can't be there and go back home, and removes his title. You can't take a title away from somebody. That title is given by a family. It's given by the broader extended family. In the case of like something like the Tupua or the Tamasese or the Tupua title, that's something that like you have to get agreement from different villages, different councils, etc., to get that title. The governor can't just walk in and say like, no, you don't get that title anymore. So they're doing a lot of this kind of stuff that is angering more and more of the Samoan people. They're angering the Afakasi, the half Samoan, like part Samoan, part European community. They're angering the small European community. Basically, everybody is increasingly just upset with how the New Zealand governors are running Samoa. And when they come together for a big meeting, the Europeans, the Afakasi, and the rest of the Samoans, they have a series of big meetings, and they send petitions forward to the New Zealand government, and the New Zealand government sends over one of the administrators, the head of, say it's the head of minister, I think it's the native minister still, who's in charge of the Samoans and the Maori, sends him over, and he's just like, all of you, when was it? Oh, okay. One of the ministers, I can never remember the New Zealand system, but he comes over and he basically says like, all you Samoans need to shut up. We run this, and he was incredibly rude during the meeting. And then he left. And then when he left, they passed laws saying the Europeans, which includes the Afakasi and the Samoans, cannot meet together to talk about politics. So they banned that. One of the Afakasi that was one of the main leaders, Olaf Nelson, he was one of the richest men in Samoa. And they exile him, they kick him out of Samoa. And once they separate the Europeans and the Samoans out, and Europeans, it's Europeans and Afakasi, but by definition, by law, the Afakasi were considered Europeans. Once they separate them out, the Samoan community, the Samoan resistance basically comes together and creates this thing called the Mao. And Mao is like the agreement, like the Mao is like, this is the thing that we all agree on. That would be Mao. It's kind of like Mao is like constant or consistent in Hawaiian, sort of a similar vibe. And the Mao movement brought people in from almost every single district in Samoa. And they had these huge sort of meetings. They had permanent representatives from all the different districts meeting outside of Apia. And they would just, first, they're just like asking the government to like, hey, come meet with us. And the government won't meet with them because they're like, you are not the Samoans we meet with. These Samoans over here, we have appointed, that's who we meet with. And the Mao movement keeps asking and asking, and eventually says, well, if the government won't acknowledge us, then we should stop acknowledging the government. And I love this. What they start doing is, oh man, I'm running out of time. They start doing stuff like, just, the government needs our taxes. Cool, I'm not paying taxes. And you can arrest me for not paying taxes. But if 90% of Samoa stops paying taxes, you don't have enough jail space for 90% of Samoa. The government required them to go and pick coconut rhinoceros beetles from their own coconut trees, but also from the government plantations. And they said, cool, we'll keep picking our own. Like, we don't want our coconut trees to get wiped out, but we're not going to go and pick them for you. We're not going to work for the government. We're not going to work for any of the big companies that are allied with the government. We won't buy from any of the stores except for absolute bare necessities. So they on and again and off again, they have these boycotts of all the big stores, just basically cutting off all the governments. And they stop selling copra, dried coconut. They stop selling it to the government too, so that nobody is making money off of Samoa. Because they know if no one's making money, the merchants will cry. And once the merchants start to cry, the government will eventually come around. They start creating their own uniform. This guy over here, you see, it's a purple lava with a white stripe. And that was sort of the Mao uniform. And the government bans it. And once you ban something like that, once you do something as stupid as ban a certain color of lava, what's everybody gonna do? Everybody's gonna wear that lava. The next day, they're all out wearing it. The government has sent troops a couple of times. At one point, they're going around and like cutting the white stripe off of people's lava. And I love this image right here because you can see this guy who's probably a Matai, just standing there, and just this kind of like, who is winning here? Is it this soldier who's bent over and trying to cut the white stripe off the lava, or is it this Matai who knows that if you don't cut it off, I win because you admit you can't enforce this law, and if you do enforce this law, I win because it's a stupid law and you look stupid enforcing it. They'd have these huge marches through Apia. So they're doing all these things, and a lot of it is created through Fa'a Samoa. Like, the way they maintained and organized it was through the village connections, through the Matai, through the young men's organizations in each village, through the young women's organizations in each village that were just part of village life. That's what allowed the Mao to continue and to thrive, because they had all those ties, they had all those connections, they had all that communication. And the government is not going to let that stand, of course. They send in troops. They send in troops twice. The first time they send in troops and arrest a bunch of people, they arrest 400 people and realize they don't have a jail. And they have to negotiate with the prisoners to leave the jail, because the prisoners led by Tupua Tamasese Lealofi are, they're like, as long as we're here in jail, you have to feed us. And now we can use being in jail as a negotiation tactic. You have to agree to our demands before we leave. And then the second time, it starts off with December 28th, 1881. They have in Apia a a bunch of former military guys that are the Apia armed constabulary, and they have rifles, they have machine guns, and there's a big march coming through on December 28th, 1881, and the cops know almost everyone in that march hasn't paid their taxes. So they say, if any of these particular guys, these Matai, these leaders who haven't paid their taxes, if any of them are marching, we're going to arrest them. And so they run in to arrest this guy, one of the Matai, one of the chiefs that hadn't paid his taxes, who's surrounded by everyone else who hasn't paid their taxes. They run in to arrest him, and the Mao movement pushes them off. And a fight breaks out. The cops start swinging, and then everyone around him starts swinging too. One of the cops gets hit in the back of the head, eventually dies, but all the other cops run back to the police station. And then there's a road, like, let's say here's the police station. Here's the police station. There's two roads. This is the road that everyone is marching on. As the march goes across the road from the police station, a handful of guys start moving up towards the police station. Tupua Tamasese goes out in front of them, stands in front of him with his back to the police station, and tells everybody, get back, like, go back in the march. You're not going to police station. We're not going to go start anything. We're going back to the march. The fight is over. And at that moment, the cops open fire. They shoot the machine gun. They claim they shoot the machine gun over their heads, but they open fire with the rifles, and they kill Tupua Tamasese. They shoot him in the back. They shoot 3 or 4 people who came out to try and cover him with their bodies to keep him from getting shot some more. Some of them died. Some of them survived. And then after that, they chased the Mao into the hills for weeks, months. Another New Zealand gunship comes in, and they have these New Zealand troops just chasing all over the island, trying to find the Mao. And most of the men in the island went to the bush. They went up into the mountains to hide out, and they could not be caught. They could not be found. And the government's like, cool, the Mao's over. And immediately Tupua Tamasese's wife and Olaf Nelson's wife get together, and they form the Women's Mao. And the Women's Mao did the same thing the Mao did, except it was women doing it, because they're not going to stand for that shit either. This is where, a little late, we get to the misinformation. None of this could have happened without the misinformation, because New Zealand is still, it remains in this period, mostly a democracy. And to convince people to do this sort of thing, to convince people that the government has the right to do this, you have to push misinformation. So for instance, when there's all this question, the Mao is there and is shutting off all the commerce in Samoa, the New Zealand government sends out a commission, and they say, hey, we're sending out a commission, we're asking questions. They created the commission in such a way that it's going to go and ask questions such as, what's wrong with you people? Why are you rebelling against us? And then the report says, we don't know. The Samoans are just being crazy. I don't know why they're rebelling. The New Zealand administration is perfect. They're creating that misinformation through the government. And that allows them, yeah, it's anti-native misinformation aimed at making the Mao look bad, making the government look bad or look good, so they can justify things like sending in the troops, etc. After they murder Tupua Tamasese, after they shoot this guy in the back, one of the highest chiefs in Samoa, after they shoot him in the back, what's reported is riot in Samoa. The Samoans rioted. There were some people got killed. The most important one is that one of the cops got killed, but then the Samoans rioted and we had to shoot a bunch of people. And it's not until weeks later that it comes out what actually happened. Same thing with Parihaka. Te Whiti and Tohu are consistent throughout their entire adulthood about peace. And as the government is getting more and more interested in running into Parihaka, they are taking, and some of the newspapers that are opposed to Te Whiti and opposed to Tohu, they start taking their words and translating them in horrific ways. And one of the newspapers, I think it was the New Zealand Times in this case, translated one of Te Whiti's speeches as, if they bring guns, take your guns likewise. If the Pakehas come and say it is government land and lift hands to defend it, strike them down. These are my words. They are the words of the Tua puts into my mouth. And it's violent, like the whole speech is translated in this incredibly violent manner. Tohu's speech by the same translator, all who wish fighting come this way. you who are far off, come this way. All I have to say is fight and kill. Don't save anyone. Destroy all before you. It may be dark tomorrow, and many think it will be fine tomorrow. What I say that all the land, what I say is all land is ours. The name is today. The name of today is Pakanga, which it means fight, battle, but also means sort of struggle. Let it stick to you. What I say, I'm done for today. All the other newspapers, everyone else who was there, translated it completely different. It was like, yeah, they're saying like the government is coming, they're going to be very violent, and the struggle is here. This one newspaper translated as violence, and then all the politicians ran with that. They ran with it and used that to justify passing that emergency bill through that would allow them to go and raid Parihaka. The government is creating anti-native misinformation, or using, actually someone else is creating it, and then they're just using the anti-native misinformation purposely to go through and attack a peaceful town. Same thing. Yeah, so same thing happens in both. You see government misinformation both. And the other part of it is it's not just misinformation, but also censorship, because the misinformation thrives when there is no competition. In both cases, they try to censor as much as possible the New Zealand press. They're censoring, like, the New Zealand government is censoring New Zealanders from writing and learning about things that are happening in Samoa or at Parihaka. For instance, they ban all radio transmissions from Samoa that don't go through the government censors, which allows the government to be the only ones that are reporting things through the radio to the press in New Zealand. And this was a telegraph that went through, and it's the following coded wireless message, and they admit it. They say, because this made it through the censorship, this has to be the only real truth. The following coded wireless message received last night from Apia is published with the knowledge that all such communications are now subject to censorship. It may therefore be taken as representing correctly the present position of affairs. Because the censors approved it, this is the only real knowledge. That's what the New Zealand government is arguing, and it takes weeks before things come in by boat from Samoa, and that's the only time when those boats come in that news gets out that is in any way in opposition to what the government is claiming. And the same thing at Parihaka. They banned reporters from going to the raid, and a bunch of reporters on the right, a bunch of reporters actually were like, screw this, and went and snuck into Parihaka to hide out in a house across from Te Whiti. Te Whiti and Tohu got them a spot where they could watch, so they could write down and witness everything that's happening. Because the first government reports about this were that, like, these horrific Māori prophets have been taken down. And what the reporters were able to show was, yeah, the government came in and they arrested people who didn't resist them at all, and then went through and started burning houses. So government censorship was an important part of the government misinformation that provides them with justification for doing things, and government censorship that provides them with a lack of an even playing field to push back. And yeah, like a little bit, when you look at Mauna Kea, kind of similar things happening. In 2015, the first time everything was going off on Mauna Kea, there was this big news story, and they made a big deal of it, and like the cops were like, this is horrible. The police investigating possible bullet hole at Mauna Kea Observatory. The Hawaiians are going crazy and shooting at the observatory. And 2 days later, another news story came out, and it was much quieter, and they're like, so it's really windy up there, and across from where this door opens, there is a bolt that sticks out of the wall, and the wind keeps banging the door into that bolt, and it makes a big hole in the door, and we've replaced that door before, but that story was much quieter and sort of not pushed. And this argument about police investigating possible bullet hole was something that the Attorney General actually used, or the Attorney General's office actually used, when they're arguing for stricter rules up on Mauna Kea, this sort of violence, this sort of imagined violence. So I'm going to end it there because I talked too much, which is something I tend to do. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I apologize for the talking.
No need for apologies. That was great. Yeah, so if anyone, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you have questions. Maybe I can kick us off with someone that I was kind of chewing over. I was wondering if you could clarify who the misinformation was aimed at in maybe both both situations. So like, is it like the New Zealand government speaking to European settlers so as to not make them feel uncomfortable with what they're doing? And then in the Samoan situation, is it like, again, other Europeans? Like what's the purpose of the misinformation?
So, I mean, it's hard to say exactly, but because it's appearing in a lot of the local newspapers and spread in a lot of local newspapers, it's partly, I mean, it's not even the government coordinating this or anything. It's local papers in the area who have an interest in the same thing. They all want settlement. They all want some cheap land out there. And so they yeah, they will kind of produce these sort of these fear-mongering campaigns. Once that one report gets out that Te Whiti was saying, like, screaming war, even though every other report had the exact opposite, a bunch of the local newspapers took that and ran with it. So part of it is these newspapers kind of, the settlers aiming at themselves, but then the government actually took those reports and used the reports to justify stuff. So in some ways, you could argue it's these pro-settler newspapers that are targeting the government with it. Now, the government also has other reports. So I don't know if it's targeting them to try and misinform them or giving them plausible deniability, giving them this sort of just enough misinformation to justify what they want to do. And with the Samoan case, the Labor government is smashing the hell out of the conservatives, the national government, I think it's the Nationals, that were in power. And the Labor government under Holland is pushing really hard against, they're saying like, hey, why are we trying to colonize Samoa? Like, why can't Samoa be independent? Like, we're independent, why can't Samoa be independent? So there is a strong faction among both some of the Māori politicians and some of the Pākehā politicians that are in the Labor Party. The misinformation seems to be aimed at like shutting them up. Because honestly, if a lot of the stuff most people in New Zealand wouldn't care about, except you do have people like Holland who are making a big deal out of it. Olaf Nelson is, when he's exiled, he's sent to New Zealand. And while he's in New Zealand, he is definitely not keeping his mouth shut. He publishes a new newspaper in New Zealand just to promote like the stuff that's happening in Samoa, and the Samoans want independence. So a lot of this seems to be aimed at creating, like, shutting up that opposition. And some of it's created by the government, like the Royal Commission, in order to justify what they're doing and to shut up people like Holland, to shut up Olaf Nelson. And some of it is aimed at like wiggly voters. Some of it's aimed at just like, hey, voters that are kind of on the edge, like, oh, I don't really care about Samoa one way or another, but if we're doing horrible things, then I'll probably vote Labor. Get those voters back on your side by sort of mudding up the water. Create enough sort of ideas that, hey, maybe it's the Samoans that are being violent, not us murdering people in the streets. I think. A lot of this is supposition, but this is where from what I've read, from what I've looked at, that seems to be it. But I can't say 100% for sure, because.
So I'm glad you kind of touched on the kind of modern similarities, with Mauna Kea. Maybe you already answered this question, but do the tactics, do they work today in today's environment? The things that they have done in the past, or through social media and the democratization of content and proliferation of video, is it impossible or difficult for controlling entities to spread this misinformation?
I mean, it depends on where you are. If you look at Russia, they have a clamped down pretty tight, but even someplace like, the US technically has a free media. We do have a free media, like you can do so. But if you look at Mauna Kea was one case, because one of the things that was really smart is they embedded reporters really quickly and were just like, hey, get Maleka Lincoln like on site like as soon as possible. Get a comms team out there talking to the media all the time. But then when you look at some of the other things, like around I'm blanking, the Lakota pipeline, around there. There's tons of video showing that the aggressors are, the paid security for the pipeline company and the cops. But even with that, a lot of people in the area had strong anti-native and pro-oil sentiment. So in some place like Minnesota, you don't need to have the monopoly on the media, but if you put out enough anti-native information, enough people will want to consume that, that even with the other stuff out there, they're still going to get away with it. They did, and people went to jail longer for protesting against that pipeline than for like you could punch someone on the street and get less time than some of the people that got arrested for defacing the pipelines. And right now in Atlanta, and people are getting hit with terror charges for trying to prevent the police from plowing over an urban forest in the middle of a Black area to put a police training facility. And they're being hit with domestic violence or domestic terrorism charges for trying to stop this. And the media, enough media will buy into it that the people who want to believe that that's true will always have that space.
Anybody else have questions? Feel free to drop them into the chat. Let me see. Well, okay, I'll ask. I'll just keep asking. Well, one more at least. So this one's not necessarily related to misinformation, but just my own curiosity. How do these kind of movements inspire within Oceania? So, like you mentioned, one of the Samoans ended up starting a publication in New Zealand to kind of share the message of what was happening. Were similar things happening in Hawaii and all over?
I'm not sure how much, because I looked for back and forth, and there's a little bit of back and forth actually from Parihaka in the 1870s to the Mau movement in the 1830s. Maui Pomare, who becomes one of the prominent New Zealand politicians, was actually one of the kids out front doing the haka, welcoming in the raiders. And he ends up close friends with Olaf Nelson and meets with Tupua Tamasese Lealofi, because Tupua Tamasese Lealofi also gets exiled to New Zealand for a little while, and talks about Parihaka. And he, in front of, when he's protesting what's happening in Samoa, he goes and says, the only time New Zealand has violated its own laws this way was at Parihaka, and I know because I was there. So there's some of that, but other than that, I think not enough back and forth, because there's other cases like this in the Solomon Islands. In the 1940s, there's the Ma'asina Ruru movement, which is very similar to the Mau movement. They just shut everything down. They're like, screw it, we're not paying taxes, we're not working for you. And we can still do that because we have our traditional ties and connections. We have our traditional form of governance, and we can just adopt that to this, and stop participating. And the so those are cases that honestly a lot of people that are even involved in nonviolent disobedience in the present in Oceania don't know and think about. And this is one of the reasons I'm looking at it more and more, is like up on Mauna Kea, people are talking about Martin Luther King and Gandhi, which is great because those are good examples. But also there's a bunch of Pacific examples that are really good to look at. Sorry, something just slipped through my head. One thing, the Mau movement and the Ma'asina Ruru movement, in both cases, the Australian government and Ma'asina Ruru movement and the New Zealand government and Samoa claimed victory, because at a certain point they're like, look, there's no Ma'asina Ruru movement and there's no Mau movement. And one of the reasons they're able to do that and end these movements is they handed most of the local control over to the native people. And specifically in Samoa, all the Mau, like a bunch of the Mau leaders, became the administrators. And they're like, see, there's no more Mau, we win. And the Samoans were able to say like, well, actually we won because we have local self-control, and use that to eventually get independence. So I kind of left that part out, but that's an important bit. These are successful nonviolent civil disobedience movements. And that's another thing that people can look to. Like these were incredibly successful, largely because they were able to use their own sort of networks and relationships within the community to bring everybody in. The Mao was probably 90 to 95% of the population during the high years of the Mao movement. Sorry.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. So if there's no further questions, mahalo again, Professor Kealani Cook, for your great presentation. Really appreciate it, and tying it in with Misinformation Week. And mahalo to everyone who came today to visit and learn. So really appreciate you guys, everybody. Thank you.